How many of us knew that Akbar foresaw the modern secular state? Or that the greatest resistance Akbar ever faced from his own Central Asian nobility? Listen to the Mr. Jekyll, Dr. Hyde personality as is revealed, and myths and mysteries are unraveled with Parvati Sharma in conversation with Anirudh Kanisetti.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I think that our conversation is going to pick up pretty much where Muzaffar Saab left it in terms of discussing a figure who is very relevant to present day debates about Islam and Hinduism and how they relate to each other today and how they relate to each other throughout time. So let's talk about Akbar. To begin with, Parvati, I'm sure that as a biographer of the Mughal emperors, you must have a relationship with them that's not dissimilar to our modern day interest in celebrities. How celebrities live their lives, who they're dating, who they're with, what they're up to, is a very important part of present day cultural discourse. And I very often wonder, as somebody who reads the words of these individuals very often as they were written by themselves, as well as what their contemporaries, their employees thought of them. Given their very unique place in historical time, that they're at the beginning of this extraordinary renaissance of sorts in Indian art, as well as a profound transformation in India's court cultures. What impression do you get of Akbar as an individual, rather than as an emperor, rather than all the present day ideas that we have about him? Who really was he as a product of his own times?
Well, that's a big question, Anirudh. And first of all, before I answer, thank you very much for being here. We made a long trip to be here, and thank you to the Khushwant Singh Literature Festival for inviting me, and for all of you to be here today. I think you're right. The more I read about the Mughals, and it's almost cliche now to say this, but they do have a sort of Game of Thrones vibe to them. There's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of contradictory stories. One person saying one thing, the other person saying another thing. There's a lot of course, huge amount of ambition, huge amount of power, huge amount of wealth, and all the various emotions, good and bad, that these things evoke in people. And when I began, writing about them, I began writing with the Jahangir. My first sort of history of historical biography was of Jahangir, and Jahangir in some ways was relatively easy to get to know, partly because the historiography of Jahangir's reign is limited, and it is limited to his own writings, which are very interesting, very unself-conscious, very revealing. This sort of diary that he writes, in which he talks about all kinds of things, from the assassination of Abul Fazl that he commanded, to his own struggles with his addiction to alcohol, he's a wonderful writer. He can describe the imagery in Tansen's music beautifully. At the end of his life, his complete sense of betrayal by his son, the future Shah Jahan. He's growing into an old man, becoming crotchety and unhappy, and all these feelings come through because he's a great writer, and you get, you are able to feel a sense of intimacy with him, real or imagined, but you get that sense, that you get when you read anybody in their own words. With Akbar's case, it's much more complicated because, first of course, there's a lot more written about him. None of it is written by Akbar himself, but it's all written by people who have very strong feelings about him. So there's Abul Fazl, his court biographer and historian, who is of course constrained by his position to speak of Akbar to put it mildly, favorable terms. And then there is the Badauni, who's writing this secret history of Akbar and is really, really unhappy and angry with him a great deal of time, and is therefore equally, in his criticism, biased against Akbar. To get a sense, therefore, of who Akbar was, I mean, that was the question that I kept asking myself while, trying to write this book. And, there was this one, I mean, besides the fact that there is so much written about Akbar, besides the fact that there is so much that Akbar himself does, his whole life is just, one endless round of conquest, administrative reform, commissioning of art, building. I mean, it never rests. So there's so much going on, and plus there are these mysteries, about him. And one of my favorite sort of mysteries about Akbar is from when they've conquered Surat. He and his army, he's about 30 years old, and they're having a drinking party to celebrate. And the face of Akbar's court has changed a great deal. He's been king, emperor for about 15 years of Hindustan now. And his army now includes a great many different types of noblemen and commanders, not just the original Central Asian warlords who had accompanied Humayun on his return to Hindustan, but also Persians, also Indian Muslims, also Rajputs, many of whom are now his in-laws. And the conversation turns to which of these communities is the bravest. And one Rajput commander offers this example of Rajput bravery, in which he says that, to settle a dispute, two Rajputs will run at a two-pronged blade to impale themselves. And what exactly this is meant to achieve is not clear, but Akbar, doesn't care. He springs to his feet, takes out his own sword, and he says, I don't need an opponent to prove my valor to. I can just stab myself. And he begins to, he's about to stab himself. He's holding the sword like this. And young Man Singh, his nephew by marriage, gets up and, knocks the sword out of Akbar's hand. At which point Akbar is furious, and he turns on Man Singh and pushes him to the ground and, is sort of beating him up, and is very, very angry. And the whole crowd gets up, there's an uproar, and one of them comes and manages to rescue Man Singh, because Akbar has managed to cut the flap of his skin here with that sword. So that man pulls at his thumb, and in the pain, Akbar recoils and lets go. And for years, really, I had this image as my screensaver on my phone, because I was thinking, if I could figure out what was going through Akbar's mind at this moment, I would have figured out who this person is. And it's not, some of the theories that are proffered, the first thing that will come to your mind is that he was drunk out of his mind. But this is not a drunken embarrassment to be concealed. This is something that is written about by Abul Fazl, that is painted in the Akbarnama. So it is an incident in Akbar's life that is recorded and meant to be known. And I don't know, I kept thinking that there must be some explanation for this. And when I finally came down to writing that part, I thought maybe there isn't any deeper meaning. Maybe this is exactly what you see is what you get. That, there is no challenge that Akbar will not accept and leap to. And, God save the man who tries to stop him. So in that, perhaps, that may have been a little bit of, to my head, perhaps the core of his character, but I would never claim to have understood him entirely, because he is a very complicated person.
That's a beautiful answer. There's so much to unpack here. What I find so interesting, aside from just the kind of personality he is also the fact that his court is so diverse. And while India was not necessarily a stranger to diverse courts at that time, possibly none had been as deliberately and consciously multi-ethnic and multicultural as Akbar's was. You mentioned that he had Central Asian warlords who came from a completely different conception of how the world should be run than his Rajput warlords. And yet they do seem to have some things in common. The fact that they all consider themselves to be extraordinary warriors. And that's really what they seem to bond over, right? So it's almost this coming together of these extremely diverse warrior elite from different parts of the world that embark together upon this imperial enterprise. And it really is an enterprise because just the way that Akbar goes about building his empire is perhaps not so different from how any family-run business would go about establishing itself. And I remember reading about how he had this very clear idea that he wants such and such forts to be set up to guard certain highways. And the geographical expanse we're talking about is thousands of kilometers. And it just really struck me to think about the sheer ambition and confidence that a person must have in themselves to be able to say that, oh, I am going to build a highway here. I am going to make sure trade goes through here, and I'm going to make sure it's protected by this fort and make sure that such and such arrangements are made for it. I believe there's one letter that Akbar wrote ordering the production of, I don't know, a few thousand rocket shells. And that letter actually still survives. And once again, I was so struck because imagine from the age of 15, commanding resources like that, right? I really very often wonder, like, how would they have perceived themselves in their world? They must have very much thought that they were, in a sense, apart from and above everyone else that they ruled over.
Well, so it's interesting actually because we are talking about both Akbar and Akbar's world, and in your previous question also you had talked about how Akbar grows out of the world that he's in, and this particular diversity of his court in the way that it evolves has something to do with Akbar. It also has something to do with how states in this region are evolving in the 16th century or so. And what is happening is that there's a move from the sort of conquest state that is ruled by sort of warlords and kings to what a modern historian has called an absolutist bureaucratic state. So what is and Akbar's Mansabdari reforms, which are quite well known, and I had not realized exactly how difficult it was for him to push these through. It was as difficult as any of his conquests. What it effectively is doing is that it is turning an earlier, it's changing an earlier system. Earlier system used to be that you have a sort of an emperor, king sitting in a certain in a city in a sort of central position, but really is the nominal head of this empire. His warlords go further and further and further, conquering more and more territory, and as they conquer it, they become its sort of semi-feudal, semi-independent rulers, extracting their own income from that land. And Akbar changes that around he changes those warlords, those iqtadars they're called, into mansabdars. And mansabdars are people who are literally withdrawing a salary from the center, from the state. So they do not any longer withdraw their salary from their conquests, but from the imperial center. And what that does is, in fact, it means that the sort of the higher nobility is no longer only comprised of military men. A lot of the people, the idea of the Navratans of Akbar, the actual term Navratan is never used at the time. There was no such category, but certainly Akbar surrounds himself with many different talented men who help him make this empire. And not too many of them are necessary, not all of them are soldiers. So Abul Fazl, who is the historian and the scholar, Birbar, who is, Akbar's enthusiastic sort of comrade in arms in his theological adventures, Todarmal, Muzaffar Khan, Shah Mansoor, these are his 3-star accountants who help him do many of the administrative and land reforms that actually help increase both the revenue and the stability of his state. These are all people who are, these are accountants. Some of them are also military men, and certainly knowing how to fight still defines a person's worth. So in the sense that, both Birbal and Abul Fazl, having never fought in a war, are very keen to be given military assignments. Birbal dies in a sort of tragic military mishap. So, but these two things are sort of happening together. At about that same time, similar things are happening in Iran, in Central Asia, in China. It seems at this point they already have a kind of UPSC entrance exam for
They've held for centuries before.
Right.
It's actually quite remarkable.
Right. So in the sense that the state is being, the empire that is being crafted by the times, and of course by Akbar, because he is an extraordinary person, with sheer force of will and energy. He is accumulating more land, more revenue, creating more systems in place that will, allow the empire to flourish.
So this actually, it's pretty remarkable to think of like how different North India was just a century before Akbar. Because if you look at the career of Sher Shah Sur, for example, he has such a difficult time working with the military labor market of North India and trying to break the power of the Afghan warlords to really set up a standing professional army that will take orders from its commanders and not just kill them if they aren't looting enough. It's a complete sea change in terms of the way that the state is structured. And I think bringing it to something that's a little more relevant to our discussion today is, of course, the question of how this state sees religion. Now, Akbar has been he seems to be a bit of a polarizing figure today, right? In a way that he has not necessarily been in previous decades. He was very often held up to be essentially the ideal Indian king. Because of the quote-unquote secularism of his state. So to begin with, and let's explore this a little bit. To begin with, what do you make of this idea that Akbar was secular? Can he be called secular in a recognizably modern sense, or was his state trying to achieve something else entirely?
So I think there may be 2 or 3 different ways to answer that. I think one could say that he is anticipating the foundations of what makes a secular state, because towards the end of his, during the course of his rule, he spends a great deal of time in famously in the Ibadat Khana, which is built, the sort of, the house of worship, which is built for theological debate, in which, scholars of all religions are invited to debate in front of Akbar, and Akbar often joins in these debates. To try, the idea is not just to debate for entertainment, the idea is to come to an understanding of which is the true religion, who is the true God. Because for Akbar, as king, his duty is to do God's will. And if he chooses the wrong God, and there's a lot of gods to choose from in India, and in his own family by now, that if he chooses the wrong God, then he could be going down a very wrong path. But he does not. He could have. He could have chosen one God. He could have chosen. There are his critics who feel that he wanted to choose himself as a new god or a new prophet, that he considered himself divine. But he doesn't. What he does is, what becomes the sort of foundation of his rule is his idea of peace for all, which is, in a sense, what secularism is. It says that people will be treated equally regardless of religion, and the duty of the state is to care for its people. And that is, in a sense, what Akbar and even the Akbarnama is doing. It's really sort of spelling out the state's duty towards its people. It's very interesting. Harvansh Mukhia has written this in an essay, that the two, one sort of pair of words that is most commonly used in Mughal writings to talk about the people is soldiers and peasantry. Which comes to us even today in terms of the Jawan and Kisan, that remain the sort of foundation of the people for whose benefit the state is supposed to work, and that is what gives it legitimacy. But that said, there's this other idea of Akbar as this, only as this virtuous king. And, on the way up here, we were driving up, and I was driving up with my mother, in fact, and she was looking for things to read on Kasauli, and we found this little video, a lecture by an Irish historian called Tony King, and he's talking about something that's quite interesting. It was a mutiny by some Irish soldiers in the Connaught Regiment, which was posted both here in Solon nearby and in Jalandhar, and they mutinied, and how this mutiny has been understood variously through history. And he talks about alternative facts, right, derived from famously Kellyanne Conway. And from there he says that of course is a ridiculous idea, the facts are facts. But he says there can be alternative genres of history. And he put it very well, and I really enjoyed what I heard of him. He said, there can be 3 or 4 different types of history. And one of them, he said, is a nationalist history. And nationalist histories, as they were written, certainly as the early nationalist history of modern independent India was written with a broadly benign attempt to forge a unified nation. The unity and diversity was its core. And so I don't think it's any surprise or it's not a coincidence that our 3 greats of Indian history, Ashok, Akbar, and then the Mahatma, are all defined by this, unifying a diverse community of people under their benign wings. And so in a sense, what Akbar gets best known for, and I remember from my own school days, was this idea of Deen-e-Ilahi. Right? And the Ilahi becomes this, this brand new religion that Akbar has founded, and that is going to bring, revolutionize the religion and get rid of all sort of communal disharmony. Whereas in fact, when you actually read about it, and you read both at Akbar's times and later as scholars have written about it, you find that actually Deen-e-Ilahi was not a religion, was never meant to be a mass religion. It was in fact another way, it was more like an imperial cult, a way of sort of binding Akbar's nobility to himself, because these are people of different ethnicities, different races, different religions. So they swear an oath of allegiance to the emperor, that the imperial allegiance will override all other loyalties. And that is what this, this sort of cult really is. So in that sense, your perspectives can be skewed when you are writing history from one kind of perspective, however benign. They can also be skewed in other ways, because, and as this same talk continued, there's other kinds of history, of course, personal histories, like, let's say, histories of the partition that people tell to each other generation to generation. There are academic histories, scholarly histories, peer-reviewed, which you depend on for your facts, your figures. And then there are, politically motivated histories in which there is a sort of an agenda that is, and that too we can see happening, just as we speak, in fact, and so you see, so let's say if your nationalist history talks about the Deen-e-Ilahi as being kind of unifying function of Akbar's, the current history, and again on the way up I was driving and I saw, we're all used to seeing the angry Hanuman on the back of cars. This time I saw an angry Maharana Pratap. And there's sometimes an attempt now to turn all our history into a kind of Hindu versus Muslim fight, and Maharana Pratap as a sort of Hindu resistance to Akbar. Whereas in fact, of course, certainly Maharana Pratap put up a very strong resistance to Akbar, but there were many others also. There was this man called Muzaffar in Gujarat, who fought for decades against Akbar, eventually slit his own throat. There was Chand Bibi in the Deccan. So again, that kind of distortion also tends to happen. And the only way really is to not overload our historical characters with burdens of either virtue or villainy, but to let them be in all their complications.
That's a very elegant way of putting it. And once again, there's just so much to unpack here, right? So let me try to take it as the conversation went. Uh, well said. So the first is, of course, the way that Akbar sees himself as a king. There's this magnificent text called the Tarikh-e-Alfi, which is the history of 1,000 years, which actually curates events from 1,000 years of Islamic history to try and justify Akbar's own imperial policies. And that is just so fascinating as a text to me because it's not historical in the way that we would think of history. It's not trying to be objective. But at the same time, it is looking at history in a way to try and justify and explain why the present is the way it is. And he gives examples of various caliphs like Al-Mamun, who went out and patronized the arts, patronized sciences and so on, and are held up as examples that Akbar is following. And there's also a caliph such as Al-Mutawakkil, who was a persecutor of Jews and Christians, and it describes how during his reign there were these earthquakes in Syria and Egypt, and thus suggests that for a ruler to be intolerant is against the very order of nature itself, and any intolerant ruler is going to be punished by God. Another way perhaps to think about how Akbar would have seen himself and his state's relationship to religion, and this actually comes from some airport reading I was doing yesterday, was that we don't walk around praising science. We don't walk around and say, oh, praise be to gravity, or praise be to Isaac Newton. We just take science for granted in the way that we see our world, right? And it would have been the same for Akbar. To conceive of a state, an institution in which God did not play an integral part would have been unthinkable to him, which is not the case for a modern secular state. Modern secularism arguably or is theoretically not supposed to care about religion at all. But Akbar is interested in religion insofar as that he sees himself as divinely appointed and must therefore protect and care for people of all religions. The next thing I wanted to explore was this idea the Mughal state was for the peasant and for the soldier. It reminds me of this very famous painting of Jahangir by Abul Hasan. It's called Emperor Jahangir Heroically Triumphing Over Poverty. It's in the Los Angeles County Museum now. And it depicts Jahangir wearing this splendid silk robe and very dashing silk slippers with a little bit of a high heel. And he's got his chest all puffed up and he's shooting this cowering dark figure that's meant to be a personification of poverty. Now, this painting was actually commissioned at the same time as a massive famine was breaking out in Mughal territories. And we have descriptions of the abject poverty that most Mughal subjects lived in. And at the same time, these emperors are claiming in their biographies, in their court commission histories, that they're appointed by God, that they're caring for the people, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important that as much as the historiography of the 1950s tried to make them out to be these ideal, uniting national figures in whose footsteps we're following, we must remember that at the end of the day, emperors, Mughal emperors or any emperor, were out for themselves and for their families and for their ruling elite. Their states don't necessarily exist. It's not their primary priority to care for their subjects in a way that a democratic state is.
You're quite right. It's not their primary. That is not. They are not. Constitutionally bound
Right.
to care for their subjects. But the better sort of emperor. And this again, I would say, would be not limited to the Mughals, to any sort of functional state, imperial functional state at any time in history. You would require a content, a peaceful. And ideally a prosperous population. You would need to at least guarantee justice and peace. And these two ingredients would then ideally lead to some degree of prosperity. So in Akbar's time, certainly, of course, there's no denying that the health of his own treasury is very much on his mind. And it's something he knows very well, because this other previous model of government where you send out your treasurer is unable to give it to him because there's nothing in the treasury. People are just not sending back any kind of revenue. So he makes concentrated attempts to increase revenue, and increasing revenue means at this time one of the highest revenue sources is agriculture. It means keeping farmers happy, and encouraging them not only to farm but to farm more, to expand their farming. And of course, one way to do this is to not oppress the farmer, and Akbar undertakes a very long and complicated and thorough process of land reform, land measurement, setting sort of 10-year averages of what kind of taxes should be expected from a certain place, from certain types of land also. More fertile land is taxed at a higher rate, less fertile land is taxed at a lower rate. Tax collectors are instructed to accept payment in any kind of coin, whether, even if it's a little bit diluted or it's not really perfect, they are to take it. Farmers who are not able to pay are not to be harassed. And these are government policies that are made. Now, how much they are followed on the ground, of course, there's always a gap, but the intention is very much there. The intention also of conquest that he undertakes both to the west and to the east, to Gujarat and Bengal, what that does is to allow trade, not just from the seas into Hindustan, but also from the center outwards. So the produce in Agra can be sent out to Gujarat or to Bengal. He sets up manufacturing units in Agra. And this is not only said by his admirers, but other visitors, that the carpets, let's say, of Central Asia and Iran were much better when Akbar began his rule at 15. Over the course of his reign, Indian carpets are as good, if not better, than Iranian carpets. He begins planting fruit in Hindustan, fruit that was earlier imported from Iran or Central Asia is now planted here. And all of this bears fruit, in fact. As you can see in Jahangir's reign, you see, when you have the accounts of the foreign travelers who are coming, and this also, where they talk about how rich Hindustan is. Of course, there is poverty. Of course, there's inequality of income. But these are people coming from Europe, which is wretchedly poor, and they see, they all remark on the fatness of the land, one of them calls it. The land is fertile, food is plentiful. Silver, they say, is flowing. Rivers of silver are flowing from the west into the east, because there's so much that's being manufactured here that is in demand outside. So certainly, the Mughal rule enriches the Mughals, but I don't think we can say that it does not enrich the empire too, and its people. And then and Vishnu. So there are many multiple things that are going on in these paintings, and certainly they are meant for a wide circulation given that context. They are not just restricted to the Imperial library. Copies are made and sent out.
I would like to discuss with the gentleman, though. I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's worth getting into.
About the question, and maybe you won't even have time to answer, but it's just something to throw out. But before I say that, I want to say, imagine if last year I received the manual from the emperor and this year I didn't. I would, what does that mean? There must be so much political strategy in that distribution as well. No, it seems like an obvious question, having Anirudh and you on stage talking about Akbar and the Mughal Empire and reaching out towards Turkey and Persia and so on. I was just curious about his relationship with the South, and with the empires of the South. But maybe that's a very long answered question. So.
Yes, that would definitely be a long answer. But I just wanted to say, when you were talking earlier about how he made the empire prosperous, we can say with some degree of certainty they didn't make the Deccan prosperous, and that was not what the Mughals were out to do. So the Deccan perspective on the Mughals and the South Indian perspective on resistance to the Mughals would be a very different story from the North Indian one.
Certainly, yes, it would be. There's accounts of these massive, cartloads of gems that are sent to Jahangir via Shah Jahan, or then Shah Jahan's quote-unquote conquest of the Deccan, which is basically the Deccan Sultanates bribe him to leave. And there's a huge amount of wealth in the Deccan that comes up north.
Thank you very much for such an informative session.
Thank you all.
We'd like to request Tara Gandhi and Bikram Gariwal to come up on stage, please.